7 words. That is all it took to stop the entire MMA world in its tracks and make everyone genuinely wonder whether one of the most remarkable careers this sport has ever produced is actually over. Alex Pereira, the man who climbed out of a Brazilian favela, beat one of the most dominant champions in UFC history inside 3 years of competing, and became a 2-division UFC champion faster than anyone in the organization's history. Posted 7 words on an Instagram story that disappeared after 24 hours. I think I've already done my part. And the silence that followed those 7 words has a weight to it that no post-fight interview or press conference could have produced. Start with the context, because you cannot properly understand what those 7 words actually mean without understanding what Pereira was trying to do at the White House and what it would have meant if he had done it. He was 1 fight away from becoming the first fighter in UFC history to hold titles in 3 different weight classes. Not 2, 3. Middleweight, light heavyweight, and now heavyweight. Nobody had done it. Not Conor McGregor. Not Randy Couture. Not John Jones. Not any of the fighters who built the sport across 3 decades of its existence. Pereira was 38 years old, already well beyond the age when most elite combat sports careers begin their decline, and he was standing there on the south lawn of the White House in front of the President of the United States, 1 victory away from a place in the sport's history that has no precedent. And then Cyril Gane dropped him with a jab in the 2nd round, swarmed with a finishing sequence that Pereira and his camp say included multiple illegal strikes to the back of the head, and referee Herb Dean stepped in and waved it off. In the time it takes to land a combination, the bid for history was over. And what followed was not the dignified, stoic processing of a loss from a man known above all else for his composure under pressure. What followed was a campaign. Pereira did not take a breath and move on. He went straight at it publicly with footage, breaking down the finishing sequence frame by frame on Instagram, circling the shots he believes landed in the prohibited zone, building a visual case for why the result should not stand. He accused Gane of deliberately targeting illegal areas. He called Herb Dean a coward. He called for Dean to face legal consequences. He said his legal team was examining whether the result could be overturned or changed to a no contest. He reshared over 20 posts about the controversy in a single day on Instagram. He called for fighters to unite and make referees liable, framing this not as a personal grievance but as a systemic issue threatening fighter safety across the sport. This was not a fighter venting after a bad night. This was, by his own actions, a full-scale institutional war. Now examine what the legitimate voices around the sport said in response, because they did not all line up behind Pereira, and the ones who pushed back deserve serious consideration alongside the ones who supported him. Joe Rogan was direct. The illegal strikes were not the reason Pereira lost. His argument was specific. The fight continued after the disputed shots. Gane landed a heavy elbow that seriously hurt Alex, and Pereira was in a genuinely bad spot well before the finishing sequence became controversial. The suggestion that removing the illegal strikes would have produced a different outcome assumes that Pereira was on his way to recovering when those shots landed, and the footage does not clearly support that assumption. Michael Bisping, whose opinion carries real weight given his career experience and his position as a UFC commentator, said Pereira's conduct in the aftermath of the loss was disappointing and urged him to accept the result and move on. That is not a soft take from someone trying to stay neutral. That is a direct assessment from a man who has been on the losing end of controversial fights and knows what it costs a fighter's reputation to campaign too aggressively against a result. But then came the detail that made it impossible to dismiss Pereira's grievance entirely. Dana White, standing at a press conference, admitted that Pereira was hit with illegal punches. The CEO of the UFC, the man who runs the organization, the man who has every institutional reason to defend the officiating decisions made in the co-main event of the biggest card his organization has ever promoted, conceded publicly that illegal strikes landed. That is not nothing. When the boss says something was wrong, even carefully and without directly overturning the result, it signals something about what the people closest to the actual footage saw when they looked at it without the heat of the live broadcast. And yet the result stands. The belt remains around Gane's waist. The UFC's stance, as communicated through Dana White's otherwise neutral public comments, is not one of institutional support for overturning a result on the basis of an acknowledged foul during a finishing sequence. Institutional appeals in MMA have a notoriously poor track record of changing outcomes, and Pereira's legal team faces a genuinely steep climb in trying to convert Dana White's careful concession into an actual commission ruling. Herb Dean's response to the public criticism was itself unusual. A detailed instructional video released on the back of the head rules, specifically explaining which areas are legal and illegal under the unified rules of MMA, published publicly in the days following the fight. That is not what an official does when he is confident the controversy will simply fade on its own. That is what an official does when the pressure of public criticism has risen to a level that requires a direct response. Dean's position was that the shots Gane landed did not fall within the nape of the neck, the specific prohibited area as he interprets it in real time, and that what Pereira's camp characterizes as illegal was actually legal contact that was made ambiguous by Pereira's own movement during the sequence. Pereira pushed back on this directly. He did not dispute the information Dean presented about the general rule. He disputed whether Dean applied it correctly during the actual fight. And he pointed to the rules meeting that had happened before the bout, the specific conversation in which Pereira's team flagged Gane's documented history of landing shots in that area and explicitly asked Dean to pay attention to it. That pre-fight warning, combined with Dean's video explainer suggesting he understands the rule clearly, is the specific combination that Pereira's camp keeps returning to. They are essentially arguing, you knew the rule, you acknowledged the concern before the fight, and you still did not act on it when it happened in real time. That is a different kind of criticism than simply saying a referee missed a foul in the heat of an exchange. The controversy gained additional traction when featherweight Andre Fili raised an almost identical complaint following his knockout loss to Vinicius Oliveira at UFC Vegas 119. Same type of foul, same referee, different night and different fight. Pereira re-shared the story immediately. Two fighters, two separate events, the same official, the same specific type of contact. That pattern is what transformed Pereira's individual grievance into something that at least a portion of the fighter community took seriously rather than dismissing as post-loss excuse-making. But here is where the story takes the turn that nobody in Pereira's corner should have been expecting, and that the 7-word Instagram story made impossible to ignore. Pereira wrote, over a video shared from a health and fitness influencer, "I'm afraid to fight again with all this going on. And then, I think I've already done my part. Afraid to fight again." From Alex Pereira, the man whose entire public identity has been built on the absence of visible fear. The man who walked into every fight projecting exactly the same composed, almost indifferent confidence regardless of the stakes or the opponent. That specific juxtaposition, the word afraid in a story from this specific fighter, is what made the MMA world stop and genuinely evaluate whether it was reading a tactical public statement or an actual emotional truth. The two things he cited, fear and a sense of completion, are worth sitting with separately because they tell fundamentally different stories about what might actually be happening. The fear is about the institutional environment. It is a fighter saying that the refereeing system has broken his trust, that he does not feel protected inside the cage in the way the rules are supposed to guarantee, and that the prospect of returning and having the same thing happen again is something he is genuinely unwilling to confront at this stage of his career. That is not the complaint of a man who believes the sport has simply gotten too physically difficult for him. It is the complaint of a man who believes the system around the sport has failed him in a specific and consequential way. That is a deeper grievance and a more serious one, and it makes his potential retirement feel less like a competitive decision and more like a statement about what he is and is not willing to accept from the institutions that are supposed to govern fair competition. The sense of completion is something else entirely. To understand it properly, you have to account for the full scope of what Pereira has actually built, including the years that preceded his UFC career. He did not start from nothing in MMA terms when he arrived in the UFC. He was already a two-division glory kickboxing world champion, not sequentially, but simultaneously, holding both belts at the same time, a distinction that has been achieved by essentially no one else in the promotion's history. That striking mastery, accumulated across years of elite-level kickboxing competition, represents a body of work in combat sports that his 17-fight MMA record does not capture. When you factor in the accumulated damage from decades of elite-level competition, the physical toll Pereira has absorbed is considerably greater than what a fighter with 17 MMA fights typically carries. When he says, "I think I've already done my part," he may genuinely mean it in the literal sense, that he has already given more to this sport and absorbed more from it than anyone can reasonably expect of a single career. His UFC record tells its own remarkable story. 13 wins and 4 losses, 2 UFC world titles, records for the shortest time and fewest bouts to win championships in 2 divisions. He finished Israel Adesanya in the 5th round after entering the round down on all 3 scorecards. He moved to light heavyweight after losing the middleweight belt and won that title too within the span of 736 days and 7 total UFC bouts, setting records for the fastest 2-division champion in organizational history. The attempt at heavyweight was the boldest move of his entire career and the only one that did not result in a belt. Whether the illegal strikes were decisive or not, the attempt itself was genuinely extraordinary. Stepping into the cage with Cyril Gane, a former interim champion with 3 heavyweight title challenges on his record, without any interim fight, without a warm-up at the new weight class, going directly from light heavyweight to the highest stakes available heavyweight fight, is the kind of thing that defines careers regardless of outcome. The 8-fight contract he signed ahead of the White House card is the institutional complication that makes the retirement question more complicated than a simple personal decision. Contracts do not evaporate because a fighter posts something on Instagram that disappears after 24 hours. The UFC's relationship with Pereira operates under a legal framework that his personal emotional state does not automatically override. But the fact that he signed 8 fights and then hinted at walking away 1 fight in says something important about the psychological impact of this specific loss and its aftermath. If the concern is genuinely about officiating safety rather than competitive exhaustion, that is actually a more tractable problem for the UFC to address, assigning different officials, creating a formal mechanism for pre-fight foul warnings to carry real consequences during a fight. But it requires institutional willingness to accommodate a fighter's legitimate safety concerns rather than treating them as post-loss noise. The 180-day medical suspension removes the immediate pressure to make any decision, which is actually the most functional possible outcome for both Pereira and the UFC at this moment. He has time. The rematch he has requested with Gane is complicated by the fact that Gane's next fight is likely the unification bout against Tom Aspinall, meaning the door to that specific rematch may not open again until well into next year at the earliest. A return to light heavyweight, where his credentials remain completely intact and where multiple interesting matchups still exist, is perhaps the cleanest path available. The Josh Hooket fight that has been floated makes sense commercially given both men were on the White House card and Hooket has been calling for that specific matchup. But all of those paths require Pereira to decide he wants to walk down one of them. And right now, based on what he has said publicly, that decision has not been made. Here is what actually matters as this situation continues to develop. The Instagram post that sparked this entire conversation has already disappeared. It lasted 24 hours, as stories do, and is now gone from his profile. But the MMA world does not forget words like that, especially when they come from a fighter with Pereira's specific profile. The quiet stone-handed warrior who projecting absolute composure in every pre-fight moment, posting afraid in an Instagram story the week after losing a title fight, is genuinely notable in a way that a similar statement from a different fighter would not be. Whether it was the raw honesty of a man genuinely processing something difficult, or a calculated public statement designed to pressure the UFC into addressing his officiating concerns, or something in between those two things, nobody outside his immediate circle can say with confidence. What can be said with confidence is this: Alex Pereira came to the White House to make the kind of history that gets talked about for decades. He left having started a war with a referee, a war with a fighter, a war with an institution, and possibly a war with a part of himself that still wants to compete. One of those 4 battles is already lost. Whether he chooses to fight the rest of them, inside an octagon or outside one, is the question that is going to define how the final chapter of one of combat sport's most remarkable careers actually reads.